people like to say that like generally when it comes to tech adoption, healthcare is like 10 years behind whatever any other industry. I would posit that like clinical trials are another 10 years behind healthcare. The way great products are built in tech is through kind of rapid and constant iteration. You can't do that in biotech with today's clinical trial infrastructure. In fact, like it's completely insane that the drugs we all take are the result of like basically 3 iterations. The craziest thing is that I've spoken to like board members of major pharma companies and they kind of know this is happening. And they've sort of said like, it's like, yeah, like, we know that what we're doing is far from optimal, but it's just turning the oil tanker is really, really hard. Our kind of hypothesis is that like, the point of highest leverage is just doing a better job on the unsexy kind of, clinical operations of running the study.
Welcome to Development and Research, where we talk to people doing things differently in the world of clinical trials. I'm here today with Meri Beckwith, who is a former clinical trials patient himself, enjoyed the experience so much he decided he wanted to work in the industry. So welcome, Meri. Can you tell us about that?
Thanks a lot for having me. So look, by background, I'm I guess you'd say a venture capitalist. So spent the early part of my career investing in medtech, biotech, and software companies. And
does that mean drugs or everything but drugs?
No, both drugs like and devices, and then kind of digital health. So like a pretty broad spectrum. And always had an interest in clinical trials because it was just like very clear to me that, this is a huge market. It's pretty fundamental to, how all of the companies we're investing in actually get to market and realize value. And, I started in sort of 2013, 2014. And at the time, this concept of Eroom's law was brand new. Some of your listeners may have heard of it, but I'll just describe it briefly. So, over the last sort of 60, 70 years, you can see a doubling in the cost to develop new medicines, new drugs, new health interventions.
That's the bad direction.
Sorry?
That's the bad direction.
Yeah. So it's getting exponentially more expensive, or we're pumping exponentially more money into the system and getting like flat output, basically, to the tune of like, the cost to develop a drug on average doubles every 9 years, which is pretty scary, right? When you consider that all of the inputs,
many of those, it's now 10 times, 16 times more expensive.
It's not like, again, I'm sure like a lot of the listeners will have heard this stat, but, it sort of takes 10 years, costs $2 billion to develop a drug. So you
need to make $3 billion back for the time and the failure rate and all of this.
Yeah. So it's like pretty scary numbers. And, obviously exponentials are what they are. And if this continues, like we will just not have any progress in medicine potentially, right? So always had this intuition that there was just something kind of very deeply broken about how we developed new drugs. And really like 70, 80% of the costs of drug development are clinical trials. So you could just say this is all the problem of clinical trials.
The slowdown is a little bit surprising, I think, perhaps, for people who see these quantum leaps forward in terms of what they read about coming out of academic labs. And so we see entirely new modalities, entirely new approaches coming out. But then, I think about reading a news story about a lab in Stanford that's developed what looks like a cure for colorectal cancer, cures 7 sorts of colorectal cancer in mice. I read about this in whatever. And then it kind of goes into this black hole of silence forever. And then at some point, it's in the hospital. And it costs $250,000, but it's actually able to help people. What is happening in that gulf?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So yeah, it's always in mice or rats, right? And not in humans. So bluntly, medicines are basically worthless until you can show safety and efficacy in humans. And ultimately, we just don't know if something works in a model or in a model organism. We just don't know like how it'll behave in a human. And that like gulf, that black hole, you talk about is essentially the clinical trial process. So canonically for a drug, it's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Typically today they're done in sequence, but they could be done in parallel, but they aren't. And that process takes, on average, as I say, 10 years. The cost, the total cost per approved drug, if you add up, factor in the cost of the failures, is about $10 billion. So there's a few different ways of calculating it, but of that order of magnitude.
I guess let's start, from the inside of this process and work our way out. You were a participant in a number of clinical trials. Can you talk about your experience with those and then situate that within the arc of those drugs being developed?
So yeah, I had this intuition that there was something kind of very broken with the clinical trial process. You could see that in like Eroom's law. I could see it in the companies that we invested in, where there were just constant issues, delays, and just nothing seemed to go to plan. And I would ask everyone in my VC days, is like, why do you think this is? Like what? And no one really gave me a satisfying answer. A lot of the answers were like, oh, well, just doing things in the real world is hard, or, oh, we've picked all the low hanging fruit. And so we're going after kind of undruggable targets. And I was like, come on, like Janssen, the world's first pharma company, was like a guy in his like basement, like zapping random chemicals into mice, right?
Yeah.
Come on. Like, as you were saying, like, we have exponentially more understanding of human biology, like that this has to translate into results. So that was all in the back of my head. And then during COVID, I was like, pretty bored, like a lot of people, wanted to do what I could to help out. And so volunteered for a bunch of the vaccine clinical trials. And I was just really shocked at how, yeah, just like it was a very bad experience. So what I mean by that, it was very hard to sign up, even though this is obviously, critical, time is of the essence, and they're taking on like virtually all comers. I remember having to download Internet Explorer onto my laptop because the website, like the CRO had built, didn't have an SSL certificate. It was like an old WordPress template. And so Chrome like blocks you from accessing it. And so I was like, wow, they can't even build a website. Like this is insane. And I calculated that this was the Novavax phase 3. So, loads of funding, Parexel, one of the world's biggest CROs, was running it. And, I calculated like the value of each participant to the clinical trials in the order of like 30, 40 grand. Imagine if you're like, just any company and your lifetime value of a customer is 30 grand, like you have, you will spare no expense to make sure that sort of sign up flow and that whole customer journey is perfect. And then on the trial, there were just tons of problems. So we were using like the market leading kind of app for recording data, but yeah. I remember they gave us like a piece of paper which said, okay, the app will ask you about your flu symptoms. Just pretend it says COVID. And I was like, what?
You couldn't have shipped an app for your trial.
Change the tech? Like, what? And the app didn't work on a bunch of models of phones. So they were giving participants like iPhones, and a lot of the older fellow participants I spoke to, like, didn't like using an iPhone because they never used one. And so they just gave up. And it was like, this is like really basic stuff. And I think it was, you've got cutting edge science on one hand, and then frankly, just like just a sort of like emergent like incompetence when it gets to the real world.
Yeah.
And it just seemed like, these problems should be so easy to solve. And so that was kind of the impetus for founding Lindus, because we could just, it was just so obvious that you could do a better job if you kind of joined up the whole process. Yeah.
Sure. So you raise an interesting point here where it's like, these are brilliant scientific advances. And then when they reach this critical stage where they're interacting with these patients, where the sort of importance of any particular patient's experience and their persistence through the process is of enormous importance to companies' commercial value, to the benefit to humanity of the advance. And then the ball is just sort of being dropped all over the place. These are not the same actors who are working in the lab and who are developing the apps and sending it with a piece of paper to the patients. So talk us through the different actors involved here. What's the difference between a sponsor, a trial site, a CRO, a pharmaceutical distributor?
Yeah, sure. So a sponsor, this is like industry term of art for the usually like the pharma or drug company who has developed the product that's being tested in the clinical trial.
I should think of this as like a professor or their grad student has left Stanford and started a company of 6 scientists.
Yeah, that's like a pretty typical biotech story. So like you might have a lab, they have a particular hypothesis about a piece of biology that is implicated in disease. A PhD student might leave, set up a lab, with the professor, 6 people, raise some VC funding, take it through kind of preclinical, and then, clinical trials, phase 1, maybe phase 2. The typical story is, that will take sort of 15 or 20 years. And by the time they reach phase 2, so halfway through the actual clinical trial process, they get bought out by pharma.
Sure.
And then pharma would take it through maybe phase 3 and then distribution and sale.
And these are household pharma names of companies. We don't need to name them. But.
Yeah. You know, any of the big pharma companies you think of.
So that's the sponsor. The sponsor is either the 6-person
biotech or the big pharma.
Or the $6 billion.
Yeah. Whoever kind of owns the rights to the actual the drug or the intervention being tested. Who actually conducts the trial, the majority of the time, aspects or the whole actual trial conduct is outsourced to a third-party organization or like a collection of organizations. You know, most clinical trials are run by contract research organizations, CROs for short. So this is a whole industry. It's about $100 billion revenue. It is effectively the clinical trial industry. A sponsor, a biotech, a pharma company will just give them a budget and maybe give them a clinical trial protocol. And the CRO will just have to go and execute the entire trial. They will then often subcontract a lot of that to other third parties, namely, you know, clinical trial like sites or clinics, third-party vendors for things like, you know, pieces of technology or, you know, loads of other kind of random services. But I think the important thing is that the CRO typically has kind of the majority of the budget. They have like overall kind of operational control over how the study runs, or they should.
I mean, should I think about this? I'm remodeling my kitchen. I get a general contractor.
Yeah.
They're going to do a bunch of stuff and make a bunch of decisions. Maybe I'm going to get involved. They're also going to hire all these subcontractors.
Yeah, exactly.
And
that's a great analogy. Yeah.
The kitchen that I get depends on all of the choices that were made all the way down the chain.
Yeah.
Maybe I've got some control.
Yeah, exactly. That's a pretty good analogy. Yeah.
Okay.
You mentioned at the start that a lot of the people who sort of come up with these treatments are very deeply embedded in the science and the potential medical impact, but there's kind of this disconnect between, you know, like you could spend, I don't know, $500 million coming up with like the absolute optimal, you know, drug for a target, and then kind of just, you know, have all that effort undone by like poor execution at the clinical trial stage. And I think you're getting at something really interesting there where, you know, frankly, clinical trial operations are not sexy. We go to conferences all the time, like academic conferences about the therapy areas that we're active in. And you'll have someone presenting about, you know, oh, this new mechanism of action, you know, this new therapy class, and everyone will be, you know, on the edge of their seats. Someone, maybe me, starts talking about clinical trial operations, and it's like, you know, everyone's faces just go completely blank. It couldn't be more boring. And I think that's like partly
if you're in the room. I mean, I hear these presentations and they end with "get our therapy into the clinic."
Yeah.
The end. Clap, clap.
Yeah.
Right?
And people just kind of ignore what happens in the clinic, or it's just seen as like, you know, shrug. It's just like an assembly line, and there's sort of nothing you can do about what happens in the clinic. And I think that's where a lot of that mindset is like where
It's
why
an
we have
assembly
these
line, or
problems.
it's a pachinko machine, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's why we had these problems, because no, like actually, so there's a great paper I sort of plastered all over our seed and Series A decks, which looks at the kind of reasons for failure of drugs, I think in phase 3, or maybe it's phase 2 and 3. And about 10% of the trials that don't meet their primary endpoint, phase 2 or 3, you know, it's not because, you know, the drug sort of, that there wasn't like a strong signal of efficacy. It was because of like an abundance of like clerical or like operational errors in how the clinical trial was conducted. So this is, you know, huge amounts of value that's being blown away.
Statistically getting there, but then it becomes invalidated by something?
So
or...
I'm trying to recall exactly. So yeah, there's this good like getting there, but then they, you know, either the FDA makes them discard data because some of the data is suspect. Either maybe there's evidence of fraud, or it couldn't be adequately, like couldn't provide an audit trail, or there are sort of inconsistencies which cause you to have to discard data. Or there are like simple operational issues like, you know, oh, you have to discard this data from a site because one real example is like, oh, you know, this stuff was stored on paper and the warehouse flooded. And so the GCP certificates of the staff, you know, and, you know, with the sign-offs were lost. And so we now don't trust any of this data, like really absurd stuff. And, you know, it's not sexy. I mean, there's just so much value that we're throwing away because of really dumb, really easily solvable operational issues.
Is part of the issue there that these things get run with like the statistically right number of patients, and then when we lose 10%, that's just unrecoverable from a statistical significance reaches the threshold perspective?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you could brute force it and just have like more patients in the trial. Like there are other constraints. So, money, I mean, budget, and also, recruitment speed. So the more patients you have, all else being equal, like the slower it will be to recruit the trial. Time is also money. So that, that factors into the equation. Our kind of hypothesis is that, like, the point of highest leverage is just doing a better job on the unsexy kind of, clinical operations of running the study.
Sure. Then let's get back to the higher level. We can have fixable clerical errors in paperwork that are causing us to lose data. We should simply not do that, or make that less likely. What are the other points where you see the standard across the industry falling short?
I think the biggest area is clinical trial data. So how it is kind of captured, stored, and analyzed. People like to say that, like, generally when it comes to tech adoption, healthcare is like 10 years behind whatever any other industry. I would posit that, like, clinical trials are another 10 years behind healthcare. And, only now the industry is starting to, like, coalesce around certain accepted data standards. So, like, the FDA, in partnership with an organization called CDISC, has done a great job of, like, now beginning to mandate this data format called STTM, which is, a big step forward for the industry. And it's stuff we've been pretty involved in recently, and there's some press coming out about it. But, generally, there's just, like, your average clinical trial, you'll have data kind of, if you're lucky, mostly captured digitally, and it'll be spread across 3 or more different systems, all of which store data in a slightly different way. And so to really have an understanding of, like, what's happened in your clinical trial, it's often like its own separate months or even years long project to get the data in a consistent format to even begin to analyze it, let alone to look for, like, insights that could help you conduct the trial better. And I think, something, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a data scientist by background, but one of the most shocking things to me, after building Lindus and, like, really peeling back layers of the onion, was just seeing, like, how incredibly loose and diverse the standards around, like, clinical data capture are.
Sure.
Yeah.
We can talk about other sort of facets, failings, successes of the industry, but what is a different world on this particular bottleneck, on data standards, technology capture, look like when Lindus puts together a trial?
Yeah, sure. And I should probably say, like, what we do is, the
Back up,
classic,
what's
like,
Lindus?
like, yeah, like, what does this company actually do? So, we run radically faster end-to-end clinical trials. So we are directly competing with and sort of, disrupting, if you like, the CRO, contract research organization market. So our product, like, is the entire clinical trial.
Phase 1, 2, 3, you've got a specialty here.
At the moment, our growth is sort of, we've been deliberate about, not trying to be everything to everyone. So at the moment, we don't do phase 1s. We don't do kind of certain therapy areas, but a lot of our work is in phase 2, phase 3, and 4. Yeah.
Okay.
But essentially, we run the entire clinical trial as an outcome. So we're not a software company, but think of it like a, outcome as a service. And, under the hood, how we're able to do that better and more efficiently is a combination of a different business model and a software platform that we built in-house that helps, our team and our sites and clinicians and patients, just conduct a faster, more efficient, higher quality trial at every step. Yeah.
You'll ship an app to the patients that manages to say COVID, and you'll ship an app for signups that has an SSL certificate?
Yes. Yeah. Low bar, but yeah. So we have there's a patient-facing component, there is a site and clinician-facing component, and there is a kind of internal-facing component, and even our customer-sponsor-facing component for oversight.
Are you on the recruitment side as well?
Yep. So we do active patient recruitment for most of the trials we run. I think that's a really important, often overlooked aspect. So, like, if you talk to anyone in pharma, like an exec in pharma, you ask them, what's your biggest pain point for clinical trials? They'll probably say patient recruitment. And you ask them, okay, how do you, what can I give you to solve this pain point? They'll probably say, like, more sites, more clinical trial sites. So your average clinical trial, you might have 500 patients. You typically see, like, 300 sites for that clinical trial.
Wow.
So these are 300 physical locations,
Okay.
each of which often has, like, a cupboard of physical documents that need to be created and signed that, get flooded, in my example earlier.
For their 2 patients.
For their 2 patients, yeah. And that is just like violently inefficient.
And all of the
But that
line
is
nurses and site administrators are doing it for the first time
Yep.
for all 500
Yep.
patients.
And that's key, right? And so one of the most absurd things of this setup is like not only is it like violently inefficient cost-wise, but it makes the data manifestly worse. Because I mean, firstly, it's just hard to keep track of all that data. Secondly, you have, as you say, like a team of, nurses and investigators at each site who are interpreting the protocol slightly differently.
Mhm.
So, adding massive variance to what should be just a clean experiment.
I guess it's wild to think of that this can be considered controlled.
Yeah.
Like I have these treatment patients and these placebo patients, and every one of them was at a different,
Yeah.
my treatment and placebo should have been at the same hospital and gotten the same.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
And that is like a really absurd state of affairs. And so we just turned the problem on its head. It's like, you don't need sites, you need patients. Where are the patients?
Mhm.
Let's find the patients and then work with the minimum number of sites required, optimizing for quality to actually deliver the trial.
Mhm.
And the kicker is like, no one like this doesn't benefit well, the only people it benefits are CROs. But sites hate, as a site, like are trying to run an operational business, you hate having to juggle 10 or 20 different clinical trials on the go at once. You ideally want 2 or 3 clinical trials that your team can just focus on
That are
and
10
kind of
times the
replicate.
size.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, what we can give people is, rather than, 250 sites for 500 patients, have 20 or 10. And, we will just ensure that we find as many patients as possible, for those 10 sites. The reason you have 250, sites, 2 per patient, is that you typically just rely on the sites to try and refer patients. But, often the sites aren't the best, or they're busy juggling their 9 other clinical trials, and you kind of don't find the patients you need.
Sure.
So that's why you have this ridiculous setup to begin with.
Whereas you're finding the patients through outreach and directing them to a small number of sites, or asking where do you get your healthcare and then picking the site in.
A bit of both, but so we have the ability to screen about 40 million electronic health records across Western Europe and the US, so we can see where the patients are already, and then pick kind of relevant sites sort of after that, or we can directly outreach to patients and then ask them. It's surprisingly easy. You'll often hear that, like, again, if you were to talk to like a pharma exec, they'd tell you, oh, but there's so much competition for patients in our clinical trials. We have 2 other rival pharma companies both launching a trial. And like, that is also kind of an insane, just like failure of of imagination almost. It's like, each of your trials needs to enroll 500 patients. There are more than 1,500 patients globally who have this condition, who fit your eligibility criteria.
Yeah.
It's just that you're all going after the same sites.
Sure.
And so you have like a site with, the 3 trials signed up, and one patient comes in the door. Who do I give this patient to? It's like, we'll just go outside of those sites, like, or just find patients independently of those sites.
How much of this is the mindset of like picking the most prestigious hospital first, and
Yeah.
then
No, that is a big part of it. And like, maybe for the average clinician, there are like 4 or 5 top key opinion leaders, and you kind of want to have one of them on board.
Sure.
And there you do get into competitive dynamics. But like, hey, like, you don't need to have all the patients come through the key opinion leader's site. Sign them up, get a few patients from them, and then have your, workhorse sites that you kind of, find patients centrally, bring them in, and get them enrolled at those sites. I'm just like really shocked by how uncreative the industry can be when it comes to these things. Yeah.
You mentioned more than 1,500 patients and we've left this condition unnamed, more than 1,500 patients globally. That requires looking outside the country that you thought you were going to start in.
So there was a big wave, I would say, in like starting in the 2000s, to look kind of outside the US. So particularly like Eastern Europe, APAC, India, and Africa. That's kind of receding because, frankly, there were a bunch of cases of fraud in those
Okay.
countries. But this was driven by like access to more patients, more treatment naive patients, new sites where there wasn't this competition for clinical trial patients. But I think, like, frankly, for the FDA, which is the US, the number one sort of market in healthcare, US data will always be paramount. And really, like, non-US data is often a compromise. Very blanket statement. Obviously every condition is different, and you might have, the way each condition is treated in each healthcare system is a little bit different. But, I've got to say, like, oh my God, trying to have like 200 sites in 30 countries is a nightmare because, every country has slightly different regulations around clinical trial startups, slightly different conventions, even when it comes to like ethics committees. And so, you just save yourself a ton of time, a ton of money by keeping the list of countries small.
Sure.
And our whole thing is like, look, if you improve that patient sign-up flow to the clinical trial and broaden access outside of like fishing in the same pool of sites, maybe you don't need to go to other countries. And as long as you're enrolling, diverse patients from those countries, they have very diverse populations, then, it all works out.
So who then are the sponsors who take Lindus up on this, who are sort of interested in seeing this? Sorry, I want to ask that question the other way. Who are the sponsors who aren't interested in what Lindus has on offer?
Yeah, I mean, no one gets fired for choosing insert big CRO here. We've been told that many times, like verbatim, by potential customers who are like, look, I know what you guys are offering is manifestly better. But, I've got a board member who will get upset if we don't choose big CRO. That board member is often a shareholder of said big CRO.
Or the investor's last successful company used that CRO and now they think
so. This is super interesting. So because we're new and we're doing things differently, people are understandably like quite conservative about health in general and clinical trials. And so the trials that are in conditions or drugs with the most medical danger or the worst safety profile are often the most hesitant to try new approaches, which makes total sense.
Makes sense.
And so, historically, a lot of our work was in what we started in like non-drug trials. So like even digital health interventions or simple medical device interventions, diagnostics. That was a lot of deliberately, like a lot of our early kind of customers were in those areas, and super grateful to all of them. We still do a lot of work in those areas as well as, drug therapeutic trials, but we still tend to shy away from like, oncology, kind of immunotherapies, cell and gene therapies, or conditions where, patients are critically ill, because as a startup, you always have to, have focus on the segments of the market that are going to be the best fit.
Sure.
So, yeah. I think your question kind of gets at something really interesting about the biotech industry. So I imagine a lot of your listeners are, kind of a split between like kind of tech people and life sciences people, right?
Sure.
Or maybe tech and they're curious about life sciences.
Let's go with that.
Yeah. I'd always had a foot in both camps because of my career background. And I always just kind of marvel at how like radically different just the vibe is.
Sure.
Maybe people have heard of like the biggest kind of healthcare biotech conference is like, it's called JP Morgan, which tells you something anyway, right? Like just the branding.
Right. Imagine if the biggest internet tech conference was named like Bank of America. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And famously, like, it happens in San Francisco in like mid-January every year. And, everyone talks about like, oh, all of a sudden there are all these like people in suits like walking around San Francisco, like what the hell is going on?
Yeah.
And I think that like encapsulates just how different the vibe is. Like everything is very formal. Frankly, entrepreneurs or execs in biotech are a lot older. Like I've lost count of the number of times I've had people tell me like, biotech, something like, you're so young. And I'm like, I'm 32. Like I'm old. Like, I'm seeing some founder friends and I'm like the oldest one by far tonight. Like, and I think it gets at something really interesting, just how different like building a company in biotech versus digital tech is. So biotech, takes 10 years, as we just said, to get a trial from like start of phase 1 to approval. But often longer than that because the biotech will have been working on it from before phase 1.
I mean, and that's what the founder who's coming out of like a postdoc position at a graduate lab, which is not what we think of as the modal founder of an internet tech company.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Founders are much less likely to be in control at like even by like the Series B in a biotech.
Sure.
So the classic story is, that postdoc founder, might get 30% of equity on spin out. The university takes like 40%. Immediately raise like a seed or a Series A round. Biotech rounds, you tend to dilute like 50 to 75% per round, which is a far cry from like the 5 to 20% in tech.
What's the capital that they're raising there? Is that because of the size of the round or because of the valuations at that stage?
Both. So biotech rounds will tend to be bigger, like a Series A in biotech will be bigger generally than a tech Series A. And the valuation will be lower, so the dilution is much higher.
Use numbers here because I think they'll be surprising.
So Series A would be like 30 to 50. Maybe, and then valuation would be like the same.
Good.
So
okay,
pretty scary. I mean, if you have like tech founder listeners, they'd be like terrified at that prospect of that,
right?
Understandably. And so, you'll have like, the investors with the majority of the cap table, and then maybe like the academic founder with on like 5 or 10% or something pretty quickly by the time this drug
By the
even
time
gets
that
to
they're
phase
treating
one.
people.
Yeah.
Wow.
And by that time, there will have been an experienced CEO brought in to basically take the product through, phase 1, 2, and 3. And often that experienced CEO is like from a CRO or a pharma background.
Mhm.
So like, just not founder mode. What I'm getting at here is just like the story is just so different from the model of like a successful tech company where founders remain in control for longer. There's, less dilution. And I think, one of the things that I've always found very curious about biotech is like how many 10 billion plus companies were built in biotech in the last decade? Like probably 3 or 4, right? And how many in tech? 100.
Right.
You just have many fewer kind of generational outcomes.
It's
Like
a little
this
bit
dynamic.
unfair because of where you picked your point. I mean, how many $500 million exits have there been is a much larger number than 3 or 4.
Yeah. But the distribution is like, the distribution looks different, I guess. Yeah.
And those are not founder CEO legacy vision types. Those are a success for all the investors and the founder involved.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think a lot of that just stems from the clinical trial process, because it's so waterfall, it's so uncertain, it's so slow, it just kills ambition. Whether your company achieves whatever 500 million, 1 billion exit or not hinges on, a phase 2 readout. And so everything kind of builds up to that.
Where there were 300 patients and 300 nurses who were collecting their data and typing them into the app that you use.
It's all like, really tenuous.
That's where your $1 billion is pivoting on.
Exactly. And so no wonder like people are very conservative, but it's kind of this like learned helplessness mentality where, if you flipped it on its head and said, why don't we have a portfolio approach? Why don't we just do whatever we can to have 5 or 10 shots on goal for the same amount of time and money? And frankly, like drug development is a luck-based endeavor.
Because of how little we understand about biology.
Exactly. Yeah. And so like, even with the best scientists in the world, with the best models, the play of chance is going to be huge. And so I just don't understand why the industry doesn't recognize that, given that, the optimum strategy is a portfolio approach. Well, we've jumped around a few different things there, but
there's something of a vicious cycle here. You were talking about how there are these enormous headwinds just structurally across the industry, how that militates against ambition, how founders losing control of their companies kind of squashes the opportunity to have this firebrand iconoclast founder deciding to do things differently when everything is being run by professional investors. That seems like a recipe for not changing the way that things are done.
Yes.
That we have this vicious cycle that because the environment is toxic to ambition, there's no ambition to make the environment anything other than it is.
Exactly. Yeah. That's kind of what I'm getting at. And so, that to me explains why, tech and biotech just like look and smell so different. I frankly think biotech and life sciences and humanity as a whole would be much better served if it looked more like tech. If you had more ambitious big bets, if people, if founders stayed in control for longer, if companies took more risk.
Let's get into that.
Yeah.
We can say that as a whole, like the world that we see would be so much better if this was different. At the end of the day, someone needs to make some decision differently tomorrow than they were going to yesterday. Where do you see the windows, the cracks in the wall for that kind of change? Who needs to do something differently and is in a position to?
So, well, I'm so glad you asked. Look, I genuinely believe that clinical trials are like the linchpin, right? I mean, as I described at the start, like it's where you just have so much of the value and cost of this whole process concentrated. But the way great products are built in tech is through kind of rapid and constant iteration. You can't do that in biotech with today's clinical trial infrastructure. In fact, like it's completely insane that the drugs we all take are the results of like basically 3 iterations. One for dose, safety, and maybe 1 or 2 for efficacy. And it's completely nuts.
Yeah.
And so, we think we can.
Where like the dosing wasn't checked on efficacy.
Yeah, it was like the dosing
right.
first, and then mostly optimized for safety with like some model about pharmacokinetically how the dose would interact with the biology of interest, and then maybe 1 or 2 dose iterations in the phase 2 or 3.
Yeah.
So we think we can cut this Gordian knot by basically giving biotechs the ability to think and act more like tech companies, faster, more rapid iteration, doing it safely, ultimately allowing them to produce, better products, unlocking more ambition and more capital. And that is like the mission of Lindus Health.
And the professional investors who now own half the company after their Series A, I can't imagine that the majority of the industry that we just described is falling over itself to beat down your door.
We don't need the majority.
But you don't need the majority of the industry to get your start.
And like, even in the last year, we've seen some really exciting developments on that front, where we have a couple of larger kind of pharma customers who are now working with us, who are kind of doing exactly what we wanted them to do, which is saying, okay, we need to run this phase 3, but could you, instead of running just like a phase 3, what about we run like a platform phase 3 where we
Say more
have
about that.
an indeterminate, your typical phase 3, you have a pre-specified, it's like very waterfall. You have, 1,000 patients, this exact design, and that's it. And you just run the experiment and look at the data.
Why do I have 1,000 patients?
You've run some biostats calculations that show that, like, given what, frankly, little data you have about the effect size and the variance, statistically, you think about 1,000 patients is enough to show an effect if those assumptions are correct.
Sure.
That's a big if.
So I write down 1,000, and then I send that off to my CRO, and CRO says, yep, 1,000, and then they do the thing.
Yep.
And then 6 months after our final patient is done, we manage to merge our different data platforms and look at the data, and we look at it and we see actually 3,000 patients were needed.
Yes, exactly. Because, this assumption was off, or maybe like, hey, all the variants that all those sites introduced, are kind of messing with the data, or, a million other things. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's obviously, that's just not good.
So what's the alternative approach here? Can I just run the trial, check every day whether I've got a statistically significant result, and then close the thing the day that I do? Is that
no? Because
that work?
That's also tricky, because you essentially introduce bias if you're kind of you'll stop the trial at an optimum point. So like, imagine over the course of time, through random chance, you happen to get a strong efficacy signal, and then it weakens over time just because of natural variation. So you can't do what you described, but you basically need to. And I'm going to get roasted in the chat here, because I'm probably getting ahead of my skis, because like I'm not a biostatistician, but as long as you kind of pre-specify what the statistical plan is and you stick to it, then you in theory are still running a fair experiment.
You give yourself an extra handicap such that when you stop, even with your sort of conditional stopping rule, and because you stuck to that rule.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think what we're doing with this pharma company is we're saying, let's run an adaptive trial where we have an indeterminate number of arms. Each arm is actually a slightly different formulation of their compound.
Okay. This is on dose, or the mixture with a different
on basically the delivery method of the compound. Yeah.
Okay.
And sort of the formulation. It's like a combination of several compounds. So it's a different blend of active ingredients, essentially. Okay, so it's varying the ratio. But let's run like one arm with blend A, and then another arm with blend B and C in parallel. And then we can, adjust the protocol if we need to. So it's basically kind of iterating to the optimal combination of blend of active ingredients. And we might also, set up new arms for slightly different definitions of the patient population. So kind of iterating to the optimal blend of like, active product and target population. And this is, really exciting because, well, from a financial perspective, like this will be just many more patients and frankly a kind of bigger spend, but the outcomes should be much better, as in like a much more effective product, and overall a much more successful drug.
Yeah. Quality of product, probability of success.
Yeah,
and
both much higher.
Sure.
Yeah, and this is exactly the kind of mindset shift we want to help catalyze in the industry.
You talk about what you expect for regulatory acceptance in this case, generally across these kind of approaches.
So yes, so the FDA is generally sidebar on the FDA. They're really, really good. They have some really good people at like designing regulatory frameworks for, in general, how clinical trials should work. So they have guidance and frameworks for the kind of trial I've just described, effectively adaptive trials. And they are very supportive, in briefing documents of these approaches, because they recognize the benefits. Mm-hmm. So that's a big positive. where the FDA can be difficult is on the individual trial level. And I'm sure this will be familiar to many of your listeners, but like, you go to the FDA for scientific advice, you show them a draft protocol of like a phase 2. They will bring in often like a third party, scientific expert to dialogue with you about the protocol. And they will then, force essentially many changes to the protocol that basically make it very hard and expensive to deliver. And this is where problems start, right? Where the FDA essentially causes this dysfunction that we've been talking about in the industry, because you'll often have the same kinds of people who are the people who kind of roll their eyes when everyone talks about operational concerns, dictating design changes to a trial without really thinking through what this will do to like how you actually recruit patients, how you work with sites, where maybe you've specified a patient population that doesn't exist because this just isn't how these patients are treated in the real world, et cetera.
What are these sort of changes to a phase 2 trial that make you roll your eyes? Can you talk about cases or in generalities?
Yeah, was speaking to a biotech exec this week who, the FDA are forcing them, to have additional kind of endpoints that are very hard to collect. So it should be like a pretty simple, straightforward phase 2, but they're having to do, a PK analysis. So basically take a bunch of blood from participants and run, a pharmacokinetic analysis on how the drug is behaving, even though kind of it's already been done because it was done in phase 1.
But the alternative is
looking at like, any adverse events that are possibly related to the drug, and then overall efficacy. That would be like the typical kind of phase two approach.
But now we're drawing blood.
That's really expensive. And frankly, who wants to come in once a week for 2 weeks and have a bunch of blood drawn? Right?
Sure. I mean, that's half your patients are
exactly
just
gone.
Then.
And then, they're also making them do, a bunch of extra endpoints that are hard to collect. So one involves an MRI. There's very few centers that have these MRIs, et cetera. So it's like all of a sudden, the complexity to deliver this trial has like increased by orders of magnitude. And so,
and the constraints for doing anything better have become boxed in because now we're these centers, exactly these patients.
And there's still, even in this trial, like you can still do it much better, et cetera. But you're exactly correct. Yeah. So like that's an example of, this science over practicalities mindset. It's the very same mindset that leads to these kind of really bloated, unwieldy clinical trial designs with tons of endpoints, et cetera. Yeah.
But you see that coming in the sort of individual trial review case, where the frameworks that are put forward by FDA staff, in fact, tend to be welcoming to these approaches.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you have this like weird duality where like, any big organization doesn't make sense to think of it as a monolith, like the FDA's, likewise schizophrenic in that regard. Yeah. Whether the FDA is like, friend or foe in this, and I guess they're both. Yeah.
Out of opposite sides of their brain. That this is,
exactly. Yeah.
Like any large organization, we shouldn't be thinking of it as
just
one solitary actor.
Yeah. But they have done, like, you can look at, you can go and look at the FDA's guidance on things like risk-based monitoring, central monitoring, decentralized trials. These are all techniques that essentially, to an extent, leverage technology and allow you to run trials, at significantly lower cost. And the FDA,
by changing how you collect data, or
so like decentralized trials would be like running either aspects of the whole trial remotely, so a patient never visits a physical site. Now that's only relevant for like a small subset of trials, but we think
for medications that are self-administered, their symptoms can be on an app or a phone call,
or assessed by a physician over video. But a lot of trials could benefit. Like my vaccine phase 3, we had to come into the hospital once a week or once a month just to fill out some paper forms. And this was like during COVID.
Not to get shots, just
no, not to get shots.
Forms,
no physical exam. Paper forms with a pen.
Why?
And I was like, why?
Right.
I actually thought, we would come into the hospital and at one point I was like, maybe this is like a stealth human challenge trial because I'm in this like windowless room. There's no ventilation and there's like 10 of us like filling out these paper forms. Anyway, and I sort of asked the investigators, I was like, hey, like, you don't want me here. Like, why aren't you just getting to this online? They're like, oh, I don't know. I mean, we just weren't given. We weren't told, we were just told to give you the paper forms. And I was like, okay.
The investigators here, this is the site lead. This is the
like
scientist
the
in charge
doctors at the site.
Okay.
Yeah. So they aren't
not
the
inventors,
CRO,
not the company,
not the sponsor, these weren't the CRO people.
Sure.
Yeah.
They got their orders from just
Yeah,
way
they
above,
just do
and
what
then
they're
that was the
told.
end.
Yeah, yeah, only only following orders. So a decentralized trial would be, doing that remotely. Have me fill out the thing on an app or, web form, whatever. I think the key thing here is that it's not all or nothing. And we think, often the most efficient study design, you have your dosing, medical exams in person, but you have, follow-up visits remotely. And patients massively prefer it because like who wants to take a day out to go to a hospital for, to fill out forms? It's obviously a lot cheaper because you're not paying the hospital costs or the site
Right.
costs.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's the thing that boggles your mind when you start to think about it. It's not only were you there and you had to be a patient who was sufficiently committed
yeah,
to the cause to go there weekly to fill out the forms, you've then got the investigator and the research nurse and the hospital staff and the room in the hospital where you all have to be. Delivery of healthcare in
yeah,
in the
yeah,
US and the UK is not cheap, and those things I can't imagine were cheap to the bottom line of the trial.
yeah,
Um,
exactly. Yeah. So this is the yeah. So decentralizing, this is one like technique you can use to remove these bottlenecks. The FDA is very supportive of it. Pharma are very skeptical of it for basically no good reason. Inertia basically. And I think this is what I've learned. I used to think that it was basically just CROs kind of not proposing these solutions or just like not enacting them because their business model means they make more money in the site scenario because there's more forms to fill out, there's more forms to type up into a database, etc. But actually,
Sorry, their costs are higher. This is better for them because
yeah, so like a CRO's business model is like just, teams of people filling out like it's all hourly billing. So the more
got it.
manual work there is, the
Yep.
more paperwork that is,
Yep.
that's all gravy for them.
Yeah.
And so, the scenario of that trial with like 200 sites, paper records that get flooded, that's all ideal for
But now
that's the
everyone's got to
CROs
read a paper record. Like you're filling it out in pen and then
typing it back
billing
in,
for
and then
by
you're
the
paying
hour
a separate team at the CRO to come and monitor it. So to look at the
to
paper
watch the
record.
person typing it in.
No, well, no. That would be better. No, someone types it in, and then a separate team at the CRO comes and looks at the paper record if it hasn't been flooded, and looks at the database and literally cross-checks them and goes, "Okay, this is accurate."
And then bills you by the hour for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent.
Yeah. And they do that, every 3 months. So, oh, there's a mistake here. This participant's weight was recorded wrong. Well, they've left the trial 2 months ago, so nothing we can do. Shrug, better throw it all out.
Sure.
Yeah.
At best, get another patient.
Yeah.
Go through it again.
Yeah.
But if we'd said 1,000 patients at the start and we discover a set of 50 that had this issue, maybe we're cooked.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And so the obvious thing to do is like not do that and just look at the data in real time, and then you can intervene when you notice these issues. And this brings me on to, I mentioned like risk-based and remote monitoring. This is another technique, what I've just described, that the FDA has guidance for. And it's just manifestly better. Like there's meta-analyses, and they showed that, like phase 3 trials run using risk-based and remote monitoring produced the same or higher quality data than the in-person monitoring that I've just described, and were vastly cheaper. So, and the FDA guidance document says like, we are very disappointed that the industry does not adopt these approaches, which is like crazy that you have the regulator like admonishing the industry for not adopting technology, not doing things that are
Sure.
Better economically. And I think that gets to the heart of like something very strange going on with like pharma incentives. Yeah.
I mean, coming from the investor financial world, it seems borderline unbelievable that there would be billion-dollar bills lying on the sidewalk here. That if you can run a $2 billion trial cost $1 billion instead, that was valuable to $1 billion. Like, who is choosing not to take that? It seems crazy to believe that in this capitalist marketplace, everyone is making this $1 billion mistake.
Yeah. True. I agree. I think the answer is just there is just so much inertia. A pharma company is basically a collection of monopolies that then has a monopoly over distribution, right?
Sure.
As a pharma company, you might have, I don't know, franchises of like 20 drug areas. Maybe some of those you have competition, but like realistically, you can just kind of do whatever you want. And so,
Think
frankly,
like airlines chopping up the
yeah,
country
exactly.
into their own routes.
Exactly. Yeah. Or, train companies with different catchment areas. Yeah. And so there's just very little pressure on them to improve or be more efficient. When scenarios do arise where there is competition, you see them act differently. COVID being a prime example. Oh, we had decentralized trials, obviously by necessity. We had obviously just much faster drug development during COVID.
But
because
there were 12 players in the game
exactly,
on vaccines.
Yeah, exactly. And they're arguing, GLP-1 has been the GLP-1 rush has been similar.
Sure.
Where you have seen sort of
the
trials
obesity drugs.
Obesity, yeah.
Because everyone is trying to bring a drug to market.
And there's kind of like a kind of.
I mean, we have 3 pharma majors and how many startups are trying to get the next.
There's different combinations of formulation and like specific therapy area, but yeah, it's been been similar. But I think the answer.
But there you've been seeing innovation in the trial design on those.
A little bit, and maybe it's hard to disaggregate. This is just like the therapy area or the intervention leads itself to it. But you do tend to see those trials tend to be run more efficiently, faster, et cetera. But yeah, it's hard for me to say.
Sure.
But yeah.
My
current hypothesis for why you have, as you say, like these billion-dollar bills lying on the floor is that just there is just insane amounts of bureaucratic inertia within pharma that massively discourage anyone from trying anything new. And I've had conversations.
Everyone's trying individually not to get fired, or everyone's trying to not avoid making their company unfundable to the next round of investors.
Yeah, same thing. Yeah, the craziest thing is that I've spoken to like board members of major pharma companies, and they kind of know this is happening, and they've sort of said like it's like we know that what we're doing is far from optimal, but it's just turning the oil tanker is really, really hard. And you've just got layers and layers of people whose sole job is to not fuck up.
Sure.
And so there's just, structure like throughout the whole organization, there's just no incentive to do something like a whole trial more efficiently. I'm being deliberately cynical a little bit, but yeah.
I want to push back and say it's possible that you're not being cynical enough. You're talking about the boards of major pharmas, and I think one of these $10 billion companies that we've seen be created in the last few decades is Moderna. The chair of Moderna goes out and says it is to the advantage of the incumbents that trials cost so much and take so long.
Yep.
And when these phase 3s, they cost $500 million and take however many years, those are run by the 15 drug companies in the world that can afford a $500 million outlay on something that's only 60% likely to work.
Yep.
And have the investment timeline of 6 years to make it work. If those cost $25 million and got done in 3 years, they wouldn't have a monopoly on absorbing these startups before they take it to market. And Moderna, I think, stands out as one of the few examples where a company could just blitz through the process fast enough without getting eaten because of exactly the moment that they were in.
Yeah, exactly. And there are other examples of it, like outside of COVID. Like there's this example of a company called The Medicines Company, basically drug for, big common condition. They got quotes to run their phase 3 internally from CROs, and they were quoted about $1 billion.
Sure.
Right. It's just a crazy amount of money. And so they basically ran the trial themselves in partnership with kind of elements of like the UK Health Service and ran it for, I can't remember, it was well under 100 million, and then got acquired by Novartis for 13.6 billion.
Great.
Shortly after the readout. So like that is the model, right? Like that's it is absolutely possible.
Sure.
Yeah,
I guess a thing that you might be concerned about as a company who's looking at this menu of options, and one of them costs $1 billion and one of them costs 100 million, is, am I going to be the uninvestable weirdo if I'm on the 100 million? If you get through the trial, is that enough?
I think it's the latter. And I think it's because drug development is so luck-based. I think people become, frankly, just very superstitious. So basically, put it this way. We've spoken to tons of people in pharma who are like, you have 2 drugs. Imagine you have 2 drugs. They have exactly the same phase 2 data. One was spun out of a lab, with some prestigious KOL involved, and the other was like a less prestigious. People will always pay more for the drug with like people with fancier names attached.
And if they're only on the market for one, it's possible the other one doesn't sell
Yeah,
basically at
exactly. Yeah, and it just it just completely dies. But like in theory, like if the data is exactly the same, the data is the data, right? And there's
Right.
no imagine it was conducted in the same way, whatever. Like those assets should be worth the same. And I think
And if there were different amounts of costs sunk into that data, if one of the data, cost 10 times as much to generate, that also doesn't come through because the data should be the data.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you just have this kind of weird superstition. So a company that was kind of doing things a little bit differently, maybe had set up their trials in a different way or used different methodologies, people would pay less for that drug conceivably at exit because of this like weird superstition about, drug development.
If
Yeah.
if it was a remote trial with an adaptive endpoint and the acquirer is evaluating it against a sort of statistically equivalently strong trial that set 1,000 patients, they all went to the number one hospital in the city, they're going to go for that one every time.
Exactly.
Over the second one, even on stronger data, even.
I think so. There aren't many kind of real examples of that scenario, but the flip side of that is like there is a lot of alpha if you're willing to like disregard all this bullshit and
Sure.
just look at the data, right?
If you can take it through whatever phase it is that you need to take it through, right?
Yeah.
This is these Keynesian beauty contests where you care about how someone else is going to evaluate the thing after it's gone forward. That there, might be this sort of collective action problem about, well, it's not clear which individual actors can intervene to pick up that alpha. You need a coalition who is capable of bringing a drug to the point where the market can tell you that yes, this is okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I think of that as by the time that the FDA has approved your drug, people stop caring.
Yeah, agreed.
And so you need to bring it there. You at least don't have to climb the hill of commercialization. That those drugs can be sold off, but it's possible you need to take these things through approval.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the ways you break this like Gordian knot is you make it possible for one company to take something all the way through to approval, whereas today that's like very, very difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
When that's going to cost an outside envelope of $2 billion, and it has from the outset a 12% chance of succeeding.
Yeah.
There's no individual company that can raise for that.
Exactly. Yeah.
But what does it have to cost? Like are those numbers are those the numbers that it actually should? And that this company that was going to raise and blitz through. I mean, we're not talking about raising $2 billion here.
Yeah.
How far can we get this down?
I think you can easily get an order of magnitude. So the medicines company example showed, you could easily get an order of magnitude lower cost.
Sure.
Take that as a hypothesis. Let's say you have, one biotech doing things the traditional way, portfolio of whatever, one single lead asset. It's going to cost, maybe if you wrap in some failures, $2 billion to get that lead asset through to, for that $2 billion, you could literally have 10 times the number of assets that you're taking through, more shots on goal. In a paradigm where this is largely a luck-based endeavor, like that is just the optimal strategy, right? It's about shots on goal, not sort of over investing in something that is ultimately luck determined. And so, so I am hopeful that the industry collectively realizes this over the next 30 years, and we just get, a very big kind of sea change in what a biotech looks like. And I think, paradigms like AI for drug discovery, where, the intelligence is like increasingly commoditized, and you just have, something that spits out hypotheses about targets and drugs that need to be tested, that feels like a pretty good, catalyst for this, as well as the work we're doing for just making it possible to run these trials much cheaper. And
that seems like a complement to this bottleneck. I mean, if successful drug candidates is commoditized, we still have this process that takes $1 billion for the drugs that work. I could give us all the drugs, and they wouldn't be available to healthcare providers until we make it through the 10-year process, unless we do something better there.
And like, Demis Hassabis, when he accepted his Nobel Prize, he said, AI will cure all disease in 10 years. And it's like, nope. Sadly, not unless we do something about the clinical trial process. So yeah.
So it sounds like you're hopeful about the direction that the world is moving. Is this through the efforts of Lindus, or do you see a broader sea change across the world? Is there appetite for this thing in this moment?
Yeah, I think a bit of both, right? I'm excited, stoked to get to work on this directly with Lindus. There is just a growing sense that the current model isn't working, right? I don't think I've met a single person in the 4 years of doing this, thousands of conversations, who was like, no, I'm pretty happy with my CRO, happy with the way things work, right?
Well, they don't talk to you. The ones who are happy with their CRO don't talk to you.
Fair. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. As I said, I think AI can be a huge catalyst. The commoditization of the intelligence part shines the light more on the operational bottlenecks, which I think are key to unlocking, frankly, just a much better century of progress in life sciences than the one we've had, as great as it's been.
One thing that is fascinating to me about looking forward into the future, I mean, one aspect of this is what AI-enabled drug discovery is going to do to this whole space. A second headline that we've seen that is already over the horizon is the rise of China in the space of drug discovery and early stage drug development. What does that look like from where you sit in your perspective?
Yeah, from what I can see, China is succeeding in exactly this with, essentially looser regulations, which does translate to lower costs, faster timelines.
Looser regulations on who's allowed to sell what drugs with what?
All of the above.
Okay.
Well, actually, I'm not sure about the regulations around drug sales, but certainly around, participating in clinical trials, all of kind of how you sort of set up and run a trial. Yeah.
Okay. There isn't this external review process.
So I actually don't know the way ethics committees work, and they can be a blocker in the West, but I don't know actually how they work in China.
I've seen some of the registrations about trial start dates and end dates, and I think it is not unheard of to hear a Chinese company which initiated its phase 1 and then a year later initiated its phase 2.
Yeah.
Which is unheard of in the conventional paradigm.
It's definitely faster in China. Yeah. Sure. I think a lot of there's labor cost that plays a role.
Sure. But there's a regulatory side and there's a cultural difference in the industry.
Yeah, I suspect so. And I think, because a lot of their drugs are kind of repurposed or sort of tweaked versions of established compounds, I think you naturally shift the focus to operational excellence over deep scientific understanding. And so I think that mindset shift plays a role. Back to the start of our conversation when, trying to describe the reception you get at a conference when you start talking about site strategy and, patient enrollment.
Yeah. I think one maybe final question, which is interesting to me, is that if this is the time that I hear about Lindus Health, and it's the I'm reading about a cure for colorectal cancer in rats, and then it's going to go into a black hole. And at some point in the future, I will or won't see a glorious streaming future of new medicines. What's ahead for Lindus?
Yeah, great question. I mean, more of the same, really. So we continue showing that we can drive kind of step changes in speed and efficiency across an increasingly broad portfolio of trials. So today, we're still sort of fairly focused on certain therapy areas, particularly kind of, metabolic, cardiometabolic, diagnostics, dermatology, respiratory, infectious disease, but showing that we can, broaden that, as well as, more of these really interesting collaborations where we are giving our customers kind of just a new paradigm of how to run research. So, more adaptive trials, looking at more variables in real time, helping them iterate to an optimal drug product. And ultimately our goal is to become the default choice for anyone looking to run a clinical study, because why wouldn't you? It's just, for all the reasons we've been poking at in this conversation. It will take time, but it's worth doing, and we'll get there. So yeah.
Meri Beckwith, thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks a lot for having me.
We've brought together an incredible group of people who are leaders in their fields. Each are coming at this from a different perspective, but the thing that unifies them is that they believe that something can be done differently, and they're doing it.
we think we can cut this Gordian knot.
You do it smarter and better.
Our equipment is even cheaper to grow.
Then brewing beer.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Giving biotechs the ability to think and act more like tech companies.
These conversations are laying out the pieces of the puzzle.
The market is willing to pay for some of these premium vaccines.
Turn down the dial on the immune system that's causing it to go haywire.
We should be looking back and saying chemotherapy was barbaric.
We have an opportunity to unlock a better, healthier world.
This is not a zero-sum game.
This is Development and Research, an interview series about fixing the broken world of clinical trials.